Over the last several weeks, we've been in this sermon series called Your New Life in the Gospel of John. But before we get to the Gospel of John, we are actually going to begin with an Old Testament scripture reading in the book of Joshua. Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 to 6. God has just delivered the nation of Israel from slavery under Pharaoh in Egypt, and they are preparing to cross over the Jordan into the Promised Land. Joshua 1:1, it says, "After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, 'My servant Moses is dead. Now proceed to cross the Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the Israelites. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and the Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, to the great sea in the west shall be your territory. No one shall be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall put this people in possession of the land that I swore to their ancestors to give to them.'" May God bless to us this reading from God's holy word. Before we can understand what's happening here in Joshua 1:1 to 6, we all have to kind of jump in a time capsule together and go back to the time when this actually took place, even 50 to 100 years prior to this, to the time of the Israelite slavery in Egypt under Pharaoh. And I want you to imagine with me what it must have been like to be one of those slaves. That every day you would wake up in the morning to go out and work in the heat, in terrible conditions, knowing that that is how your life will be for the rest of that day and the weeks and months and years to come. The Pharaoh claims himself to be deity and says that he is to be worshipped as God. And he was afraid that the Israelites would grow in number and multiply so much that they would outnumber the Egyptians. So he said that all male-born children were to be slaughtered. So the very rug on which their ancestry stood was pulled right out from under them. Of all the times when the nation of Israel was hit with difficult circumstances as nations oppressed them, this is one of, if not the absolute worst time of all. They were surrounded by terrible circumstances. And so today, as we continue in the sermon, we're going to be using the word circumstance, because it gives this idea that you are encircled or surrounded by negativity. And so as we approach our gospel reading in the Gospel of John, we're going to be in chapter 10, verses 22 to 40, and I'm going to be skipping just a few of those verses as we go along. But we have to know that the nation of Israel, they are still being oppressed. They're still being persecuted. It's not by Pharaoh in Egypt, and it's not in Babylonian exile, but they are being persecuted by the Romans here in the first century. So the Caesar has hiked up taxes so high that they can barely afford to live. And he too says that he is deity and he is to be worshipped as God. They are surrounded by some difficult circumstances. So it says this, John chapter 10, verses 22 to 40. "At that time, the festival of dedication took place in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple, in the portico of Solomon. So the Jews gathered around him and said to him, 'How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly.' Jesus answered, 'I have told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name testify to me, but you do not believe because you do not belong to my sheep. My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. What my Father has given to me is greater than all else, and no one can snatch it out of my Father's hand. The Father and I are one.' The Jews took up stones again to stone Jesus. Jesus replied, 'I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these are you going to stone me?' The Jews answered, 'It is not for a good work that we are going to stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, though only being a human, are making yourself God.'" We're going to skip to verse 37. "If I am not doing the work of the Father, then do not believe me. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, so that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father." Then they tried to arrest him again. but he escaped from their hands. He went away across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing earlier, and he remained there. May God bless to us this reading from God's holy word. So again, for us to understand what's happening here in this gospel reading, we have to jump into that time capsule and go to the time when this actually happened. And note that the gospel writer, John, he wants us to see that they are being surrounded by circumstances, 3 in particular, right at the very setting of our story. First, it says it's the festival of dedication. Then it says it's winter, and then it says that they're standing in the portico of Solomon. So the festival of dedication, that is simply a time when they remember that 160 years prior to this happening, Antiochus Epiphanes, this Greco-Syrian god, set up an altar to the god of Zeus right on top of the altar to the one true God in the Jewish temple. They finally cleared out all the desecration as they revolted against him. They cleaned it up, and they had a festival of dedication, rededicating the temple. So right as they begin this, they say that this is the moment where Jesus is standing there, and they are remembering and having this festival of dedication where they remember that the Israelites were surrounded by difficult circumstances. It says it is winter, and they're standing on the porch or portico of Solomon. Solomon is another king who represents negative circumstances. Because when he was the king, everything was fine, but by the time he was finished with Israel, they were split into two nations, and they were headed toward Babylonian exile. All these things represent some very difficult circumstances. And so then we find Jesus, and he is surrounded by people who want to take up some stones and stone him. He is literally encircled by people with stones trying to kill him. And I don't know about you, but I've been in some pretty difficult circumstances in my life, and there's never been a time where anyone has taken up stones to kill me, at least not that I know of anyway. When I was in college, I had a 1994 Nissan Sentra, and it was red. It was like the coolest car ever, and about midway through college, it had upwards of 250,000 miles on it. And so there would be all these times where I'd be driving along in this car, and all of a sudden you'd hear that noise you never want to hear, where it's just like, and I'm kind of pulled off to the side of the road, and I don't know what's going on. I finally, being the macho man that I am, I pop the hood and I kind of swagger around to the front of the car, and I take 15 minutes trying to find the latch to get and I finally get the hood up and prop it open. I roll up my sleeves and I take a look inside, and I immediately slam the hood back down and call somebody because I have no idea what I'm looking at when I try to identify the problem with my car. What I hope we'll be able to do today is to know that we aren't all that different from the nation of Israel in the days of slavery under Pharaoh in Egypt. We aren't all that different from the first century Jews who surrounded Jesus that day. We aren't all that different from Jesus as he was there surrounded with people picking up stones. That as you have come here tonight, maybe it is that you are facing some difficult circumstances, that you are surrounded with negativity. And the hardest part, I think, is for us just to identify what our circumstances actually are. Sometimes you think you have a handle on it, but in reality, there are all kinds of dynamics surrounding you, and you have no idea what they really are. Maybe it is that you have some kind of outside circumstance, something that's coming at you, and it's something you just can't control. Maybe it is that you are just trying to figure out you. You know, Americans spend millions of dollars every year trying to figure out things about themselves because they realize, we all realize sometimes, there's something about ourselves that causes us to have difficulty as a husband, wife, brother, sister, mother, father, employer, employee, student, teacher, whatever it might be. You're just trying to figure out you, maybe. Maybe it is that you would say, you know, I can't come to God because of something I did. There's something going on in my life, and because of it, I just can't come to God. And so what I hope we do is we just kind of slam that hood down, pick up the phone, and today, all together, we might be able to say, God, we need your help just to identify what our circumstances actually are, because God, you know our situation way better than even we do. There was a little boy who came home from Sunday school one Sunday morning. And the first thing he did when he came in the doors, he ran and he got the biggest paintbrush he could possibly find. He splattered a bunch of paint on a plate, and he started to paint this beautiful picture right here. And so he was painting this picture, and his dad walked up to him, seeing that he was kind of making a monstrosity with the paint, and he looked at his son and he said, "What are you drawing? What is it? It looks great." And the little boy continued to draw, and he said, "Well, Dad, when we were in Sunday school today, we learned about God delivering his people from Egypt, and the teacher said, when you get home, I want you to paint a picture of what it looks like to be delivered." He said, "I'm painting my picture." And so the dad, in his wisdom, wanting to have a conversation with his son, he said, "Well, how do you know what that looks like?" And so the little boy stopped painting and thought about it for a second. And then he took the paintbrush and he held it up and he said, "I have no idea what that looks like." He said, "But would you paint that picture for me?" And so I wonder what it may have been like as one of those Egyptian slaves, that if you were to walk up to one of them and you were to say, "Here, I want you to paint a picture of what it looks like for you to be delivered." I imagine that they would come and they would draw a picture, and maybe that picture would have some bread, as if to say, "I just want a little bit more food," or some more water. Or maybe they would draw a picture of the Pharaoh and put a big X across his face, as if to say, "We don't want to be oppressed by Pharaoh anymore. We don't want to be a part of Egypt. We just want to live in the land as a sovereign country and have our own sense of national identity. That's all we want." They would draw a picture of the way they wanted to be delivered. But the thing is, God wasn't going to deliver them from their circumstances the way they wanted to be delivered. Not one of them would have drawn a picture here of 10 plagues and 40 years in the wilderness. But the picture that God drew for them, as we read in Joshua 1:1-6, it was far greater than anything they could have ever imagined. It was going across the Jordan River into the land of promise, the land of milk and honey, and they got to stay there forever. Everything we read as they prepare to go into that land tells us that they were preparing to stay. And so I wonder if we were to go to the first century, to the time when all of these Jews are surrounding Jesus as they are being oppressed by Rome, and you walk up to one of them and you say, "Here, I want you to paint a picture of what it looks like for you to be delivered." I imagine they might draw a picture of this godlike figure coming out of the clouds, riding on a big white horse, backed by all the armies of heaven, with the shout of the archangel and the trumpet of God coming to stamp out the imperial powers of Rome. And so they come to Jesus and they say, "If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly. When are we going to draw our swords? When are we going to join your army?" But in reality, the God of the universe stepped out of time, out of eternity and into time, came to a world that would offer him nothing but a cattle shed in which to be born and a cross on which to die. Jesus grew up as a peasant carpenter's son, and he never spoke about rising up against Rome, but would say things like, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's." Jesus would never ride in on a big white horse. But when he finally did come into Jerusalem, he was riding on the colt of a donkey. He didn't even ride in on a big donkey. He rode in on a colt of a donkey. Not exactly the picture of the Messiah they were looking for. Because Jesus wasn't going to deliver them from their circumstances the way they wanted to be delivered. And the way Jesus drew that picture was the picture of a cross. His picture of delivering them was far greater than anything they could have ever imagined. And so as Jesus is facing some circumstances, it tells us at the very end, in verse 40, he went away again across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing earlier, and he remained there. So as Jesus is faced with difficult circumstances, he removed himself from that situation. He went across the Jordan to that land of promise, to the place where he first heard God claiming him as his child. And it says that he remained there. We don't know how long Jesus stayed there, but we know that's the last place he was before he headed down into Jerusalem, headed toward the cross. There was a patient who came to the doctor and he said, "Doctor, I've been really stressed out." He said, "Things have been so crazy recently." And he said, "Because I've been so stressed out, it's making me sick." And so the doctor said, well, I checked you out, and physically you are totally fine. He said, let me tell you a story. He said, just 2 weeks ago, I had a guy who came in here just like you. He was all stressed out. And he said, I asked him what he was stressed out about, and he said, well, he had this $5,000 debt, a $5,000 IOU. So the doctor said, I took it away from him, I ripped it into pieces, and I gave it back to him as if to say, don't even worry about it anymore. He went on his way, and since then, he's been fine. You just need to stop being stressed. So the guy looked really perplexed, actually looked pretty angry. And he said, I'm sure he was fine. I'm the one he owed $5,000 to. If only we could take all of our debts and rip them up like that, and they just wouldn't exist anymore. After the nation of Israel came out of Egyptian slavery, they finally went to the land, and God said to them, I want you to observe this Passover meal every year. And as he told Moses, I want you to do this. This is what God did not say. He did not say, every year, I want you to have this Passover meal. And every time you eat this meal, Moses, I want you to remember that you killed a guy in Egypt. And Aaron, every time you eat this meal, I want you to know that, and to remember that you built a golden calf so that they could worship a false god. And all of you Israelites, you've done some really bad things. You know, you've sinned, you've been cursing and lying and all these things. I want you to remember that at the Passover. That is not what God said. Because God had completely removed the debt of their sin, but called them to remember being delivered from their circumstances. Their sins, he never brought them up again. But he wanted them to remember that they were delivered and wanted them to remember what they had been delivered from. And so as we go into this upcoming sermon series that begins next week, going into Lent, it's called Securing to Risk. We're going to be doing a lot of thinking about what happened there in the upper room. As Jesus took the bread and he broke it and said, this is my body broken for you. And he poured out the wine and said, this is my blood. And then this is what Jesus didn't say. He didn't say, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, Peter, I want you to remember you chopped a guy's ear off, and that was really bad. And I want you to remember that you denied me 3 times. And Matthew, you were a tax collector, you cheated a lot of people. That's not what Jesus said. Because Jesus had completely removed the debt of their sin, but called them to remember being delivered from their circumstances. And so every time we sit down to have that communion meal, we don't have to worry about our sin. What we remember is we remember that we were delivered and remember what we were delivered from. And so it is that as we've all come here today, that maybe you're facing some difficult circumstances. Maybe you're surrounded by negativity at every angle, everywhere you look. And we've begun that difficult task of just trying to identify what our circumstances actually are. Maybe it's something that you can't control. Maybe it is that you're trying to figure out you. Maybe you would say, well, I have this sin, or I have this thing, this stuff in my life, and because of it, I can't come to God. Whatever it might be, I think that we all paint a picture of the way we want to be delivered. But we know that God doesn't always deliver us from our circumstances the way we want to be delivered. God calls us to know that he removes the debt of our sin and wants us to remember being delivered from our circumstances. So may we all be just like that little boy that day. And may we all be able to hold this paintbrush up in the air and be able to say, God, I don't know what it looks like to be delivered, but I want you to deliver me on your terms. I want to cross over Jordan and live in that land of milk and honey right now, and I want to stay there. In a few moments, the band is going to come, and we're going to have a time where we can respond for a few seconds. And as you pray and as you're sitting there talking to God, I have just a few ideas of some ways you might want to respond. You might say, God, I just need your help to identify what my circumstances actually are. I don't even know what they are. God, just help me identify. Or you might say, God, I've been painting a picture of the way I want to be delivered, but I want you to deliver me on your terms. Or maybe it would be, God, I just want you to help me remember all the times throughout my life when you've been delivering me from my circumstances all along. There's just a few ideas of some ways you can respond. Let's all pray together. God, we love you, and we know that that we all face difficult circumstances. There is no doubt about that. That everyone here in this room right now, that we face circumstances. We are surrounded by negativity. Some of us are trying to think about what that is. God, I ask that for those people that you would enlighten them, that your Holy Spirit would sweep across this place, and that they would come to a better understanding of the things that they're facing, whether it be a sin or whether it be that they feel like there's these outside things they can't control. Maybe it is, God, that someone here is painting a picture of the way they want to be delivered. But God, we know that often you deliver us in a much different way. I can't tell you, God, how many times I've talked to you and I said, help me with this one thing. And when you finally bring me out of it, it's far better than anything I would have hoped for. Help us to remember all the times when you deliver us from our circumstances. So I ask for your Spirit to be in this place as we all come and meet with you now.